She showed up at his door with a dead man's letter, a broken wagon axle, and exactly $14 to her name. He hadn't spoken to another human being in 11 days. The wind was already turning mean, the kind of cold that killed cattle before morning, and Gideon Mercer stood in his doorway staring at this woman like she was a problem he hadn't budgeted for. She stared right back. Neither of them blinked, and somehow, before the sun went down that day, they were engaged to be married. Two complete strangers who didn't even know each other's middle names. If you've ever made a decision out of pure desperation and somehow ended up exactly where you were supposed to be, this story is for you. Stay until the end. Drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled. The morning Thomas Rowan died, the sky above the Salmon River country was the color of old pewter. Not storming, not clear, just that flat, heavy gray that settles over Idaho territory in late October, like a wool blanket soaked through with rain. It was the kind of sky that made a man feel small without knowing exactly why. Gideon Mercer was splitting wood when they brought him the news. He didn't stop splitting immediately. He finished the log he was working on, set the halves aside, and then drove the axe head into the stump and left it there. The man who'd ridden over, a ranch hand from a spread 2 valleys east named Calhoun, watched him do all of this and didn't say a word. He'd been warned, apparently, that Mercer wasn't the type who appreciated people hovering while he processed things. When? Gideon asked. 2 nights ago. Fever took him fast. He was already gone by the time Doc Hamlin got there from Chalice. Gideon nodded once. He picked up the wood he'd split, stacked it against the side of the cabin with the same methodical care he gave everything, and then walked to the water trough and washed his hands even though they weren't dirty. Old habit. Something to do when there was nothing to do. Thomas Rowan, 61 years old. The best tracker in the territory, possibly the best shot, and the only man in Gideon's memory who'd ever pulled him back from the edge of something he couldn't return from. Not once, but twice. In circumstances that Gideon didn't talk about, and most people had the sense not to ask. He left something for you, Calhoun said. He held out a sealed envelope, folded thick, the wax stamped with no particular mark, just pressed with a thumb. His daughter's got the rest of his affairs in order. She's in Chalice right now, at the boarding house. Gideon took the envelope. Thank you for riding out. That was as close to warmth as he usually got, and Calhoun seemed to understand it. He touched his hat brim and turned his horse back down the track without another word. Gideon didn't open the letter until that evening. He sat at the table he'd built himself from rough-hewn pine, the one that was slightly uneven on the left side because he'd measured wrong and been too stubborn to tear it apart and start over. And he held the envelope for a long time before he broke the seal. Thomas's handwriting was careful, deliberate. A man who hadn't gone to much school but had decided that if he was going to write something, he was going to write it properly. Gideon, if you're reading this, I've gone ahead without saying goodbye in person, which I regret. I was never much for goodbyes anyway. You know that. I'm not going to waste your time on sentiment. You've never much cared for it, and I've always respected that about you, even when it made you difficult to be around. I have one thing left to ask of you. Her name is Eliza. She's 24 years old and she's the smartest person I've ever known, which is not something I say lightly given that I've known you. She has her mother's stubbornness and my terrible luck with money, which means she is currently in a difficult situation that she did not create but will have to survive regardless. I'm not asking you to feel sorry for her. She would hate that. I'm asking you to be useful to her in whatever way you can manage. I have told her you are the most capable man I've ever trusted my life to, and that is the absolute truth. The rest is up to you both. Thomas Gideon read it twice. Then he folded it carefully and set it on the table beside his coffee cup, which had gone cold an hour ago. He sat there for a while, listening to the wind pick up outside. Then he put on his coat and went to check on the horses, because that was what he did when he needed to think, and the inside of the cabin felt too small for it. He drove to Chalice 3 days later. He told himself he was going for supplies, which was also true. He needed oats, lamp oil, and a new draw knife because the handle on the old one had finally cracked past the point of usefulness. He told himself the stop at the boarding house was a courtesy call, nothing more. A man paid his respects, that was all. The boarding house was run by a woman named Mrs. Pearl Hutchins, who was approximately 70 years old, had the energy of someone considerably younger, and knew everything about everyone within 40 miles. She greeted Gideon at the door with the carefully neutral expression of someone who had already formed strong opinions about him. "She's in the back parlor," Pearl said. "I'll tell you now, she hasn't eaten much today. She's been doing that, forgetting to eat when she's working through something. Her father was the same way." "Thank you," Gideon said. "You're Mercer." It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am." Pearl studied him the way a horse trader studies a horse. Not unkindly, but thoroughly. "Thomas spoke highly of you. That's not nothing. He was stingy with his praise." "He was," Gideon agreed. She stepped aside and let him in. Eliza Rowan was sitting at a writing desk in the corner of the parlor when he found her, with what looked like a stack of financial documents spread out in front of her in a pattern that probably made sense to her and no one else. She was making notes in the margins of something, her handwriting small and precise, and she didn't look up when he came in. "Mrs. Hutchins, I told you I'm not hungry," she said, without turning around. "I'm not Mrs. Hutchins." She turned then. Gideon's first impression was that she looked nothing like Thomas except for the eyes, dark brown, direct, with a quality of absolute attention that made you feel you were being assessed whether you liked it or not. Her hair was dark and pinned up in a practical way that suggested she hadn't been spending much time worrying about how it looked. She was wearing a plain gray dress with ink on the cuff of the right sleeve. She didn't look fragile. That was the thing he noticed first and kept coming back to. There were circles under her eyes, and her face had the tight, controlled look of someone who'd been managing grief by staying very busy. But she didn't look like a woman waiting to be rescued. "Mr. Mercer," she said. Not a question either. "Miss Rowan? You got the letter." Also not a question. "I did." She turned fully in her chair and looked at him straight on. "You don't have to do anything. I want you to know that first. Whatever my father asked, it was his wish, not mine. I'm not here to collect on a debt." "I didn't think you were." "Good." She turned back to her papers. "Then we understand each other." Gideon pulled out the chair across the desk and sat down without being invited. She glanced at him sideways, a flicker of something. Surprise, maybe irritation. But she didn't tell him to leave. "What are those?" he asked, nodding at the documents. "My father's debts." She said it flat, without self-pity. "He had more than I knew about. Feed supplier, land survey fees, a loan from a man in Boise that I was not aware of until 3 days ago." She tapped the edge of one paper against the desk to straighten it. "The property he owned free and clear doesn't exist. The cabin and the acreage are both mortgaged. The bank has been patient so far, but patient has a limit." "How much?" $240. In 1882 Idaho territory, that was not a small number. Gideon said nothing for a moment. "I have $14, Eliza said, in the same flat tone. "I have a horse that's worth maybe 30, if someone's feeling generous. I have the tools in my father's wagon and some household goods. I can work. I'm good with accounts. I read well. I can manage a household efficiently." She paused. "There are not many places in this territory that need those particular skills and are willing to pay a woman fairly for them." "No," Gideon said. "There aren't. So." She turned to face him again, and there was something very steady in her expression. Not hopeless exactly, but clear-eyed in the way that people get when they've already thought through all the bad options and are ready to start listing the less bad ones. "I'm going to figure something out. I always have. But I thought I should be honest with you about the situation, since my father asked you to help, and you were decent enough to come." Gideon looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "How long have you been in Chalice?" 11 days. "And in 11 days, what have you come up with?" A muscle in her jaw tightened slightly. "I am still working on it." He nodded slowly. He turned and looked out the parlor window. Outside, Main Street was doing its quiet October business. A freight wagon rolling past, 2 men talking in front of the hardware store, a dog sleeping on the steps of the saloon. Normal life, the kind that required a person to have somewhere to be when the day was over. What he did next surprised him more than it surprised her. "I have a ranch," he said, "about 16 miles west. Creek access, good winter grazing if the snow doesn't come in too hard, which it will, but there's decent shelter for the animals. House is solid. I built it myself. It's not comfortable exactly, but it's livable." Eliza waited. "I've been running it alone for 6 years. I'm a fair rancher, but the business side of it, the books, the accounts, I'm not good at it. I know what I'm bad at. He said this matter-of-factly, without embarrassment. The place could do better than it does with someone who had sense about those things. Mr. Mercer. I'm not offering charity, he said, before she could say it herself. I'm offering a practical arrangement. You would have a home, food, protection, and a share of whatever the ranch earns. In return, you'd manage the household and the accounts, and pull your weight however the work requires. Eliza was very still. What kind of arrangement exactly? He met her eyes. Marriage. The word sat between them like a stone dropped in still water. She didn't gasp. She didn't laugh. She looked at him with those direct, measuring eyes and said nothing for what felt like a considerable time. You don't know me, she finally said. No. I don't know you. No. My father trusted you, she said slowly. He trusted very few people. I know. That's... She stopped, started again. That's not nothing, but it's also not a reason to marry someone. It's not, Gideon agreed. The reason is practical survival, yours and mine both. I'm not dressing it up as anything else. She stood up from the desk and walked to the window, looking out at the same street he'd been watching. He could see her thinking, not in the scattered, anxious way of someone panicking, but in the systematic way of someone laying out a problem and examining each side. What are the terms? She asked, still looking out the window. Honest terms. You'd run the house as you saw fit. You'd have full access to the account books. Your name on the deed, same as mine. If it doesn't work, if either of us decides after a fair trial that this was a mistake, we figure out a different arrangement. But you'd have time to figure it out from a stable position instead of from nothing. She was quiet. I won't pretend I'm a pleasant man to live with, he added. I'm told I'm not. I keep strange hours. I don't talk much. I have opinions about how things should be done, and I'm not always easy about changing them. Why are you telling me that? Because you deserve to know what you're agreeing to. She turned from the window then and looked at him for a long time. And whatever she was looking for in his face, she seemed to find enough of it to keep going. I would need my own room, she said. The cabin has 2. I would have authority over the household accounts. Complete authority. You don't override my decisions on the finances without a discussion first. Agreed. And if I discover the situation on the ranch is worse than you're representing, it's not worse than I'm representing, he said. It's not good, but it's not worse. She nodded, one short, precise nod like she was checking something off a list. Then I'll think about it. That's fair. I mean, I'll have an answer by tomorrow morning. I'm not asking for a week. I'll be at the feed store until noon, he said, and stood up. After that, I need to start back. He was at the door when she spoke again. Mr. Mercer. He turned. My father said you were the best man he'd ever trusted his life to. She paused. He was careful with words. He didn't say things he didn't mean. No, Gideon said. He didn't. I know. She held his gaze. I just wanted you to know that I know that. He nodded once and went out. He was loading oat sacks onto the wagon at 9:10 the next morning when he heard footsteps behind him on the boardwalk. He didn't turn around, but he stopped what he was doing. Yes, Eliza Rowan said. He turned around then. She was standing in the early light with a travel bag at her feet and her chin at an angle that made it very clear she was not asking for reassurance. All right, he said. I have conditions. You mentioned conditions. I have more conditions than I mentioned yesterday. He picked up her travel bag and put it in the wagon. Get in. You can tell me on the road. She got in. The justice of the peace in Chalice was a round, good-natured man named Aldridge, who performed civil ceremonies 3 mornings a week between his regular duties and showed no particular curiosity about the people who appeared before him. Gideon and Eliza stood in front of his desk at 11:15, with Pearl Hutchins as witness because she'd appeared without being asked, and neither of them had the energy to argue about it. The ceremony took less than 7 minutes. When Aldridge asked if Gideon took this woman, Gideon said, I do, in the same tone he might use to confirm an order at the hardware store. When he asked Eliza, she paused for 1 beat, not dramatically, just the honest pause of someone finishing a decision she'd already mostly made, and then said, "I do." No vows beyond the standard ones. No flowers. Pearl cried a little, which neither of them commented on. Outside, on the boardwalk after, Eliza stood very straight and looked at the wagon and then at the sky. 16 miles, you said. About that. Will we make it before dark? If we leave now. She picked up the hem of her dress and climbed up onto the wagon seat without help, which he hadn't offered. He climbed up the other side. The horses shifted, ready. "Mr. Mercer," she said. Gideon. A pause. "Gideon." She said it like she was trying the weight of it. "I want you to know that I am not a person who goes back on an agreement. I didn't think you were. I also want you to know that I am not easy to live with either." She said this very evenly. "I have been told this more than once by people who were close to me. I thought it was only fair to mention it." He looked at her. The October sun was low, catching the side of her face. "Good," he said. "That makes two of us." Something that was almost a smile crossed her face. There and gone so fast he might have imagined it. He clicked to the horses, and they pulled out onto the road heading west, into the cold, bright morning, leaving Chalice behind them. The first hour was quiet. Not uncomfortable exactly, but careful. The silence of two people who have run out of formal things to say and haven't yet arrived at the informal kind. Eliza sat with her travel bag on her lap and watched the country roll past. Gideon drove and did not attempt conversation because he was genuinely not good at it, and she seemed like someone who would prefer honesty to effort. The country was beautiful in the way that Idaho in October is beautiful. Spare and enormous, the mountains in the distance wearing the first hard edges of snow, the valley floor yellow and brown and rust with the season turning over. The road was rough where it crossed creek drainages and smoother on the ridge stretches. The horses knew this route, which helped. "What's the stock situation?" Eliza asked eventually. He glanced at her. 18 head of cattle, 6 horses, 2 mules I use for freight work. Chickens? Not sure exactly how many. They've been productive this year. 2 dogs. Named? The dogs? The dogs. Saber and Rook. After chess pieces? After the fact that one looks like he should be named Saber and the other looks like he should be named Rook. She considered this. What do they look like? Saber's big, brown and white. Rook's smaller, black. They're good working dogs, but Rook has a habit of stealing things. What kinds of things? Gloves, mostly. Occasionally a boot. Once an entire baked pie that I'd left on the windowsill to cool. A pause. I was not happy about the pie. I imagine not. She was quiet for a moment. My father had a dog named Cartwright, named after a judge he didn't like. Said it was the only kind of justice he trusted, the kind you could train. Gideon said nothing, but something in his chest settled slightly. That was exactly the kind of thing Thomas would say. He talked about you, Eliza said. Not often, but when he did, he was serious about it. He said you never talked just to fill space. She paused. I appreciate that. Your father was the same way. I know. Softer now. I know he was. She went quiet, and he let her be quiet, and the horses moved steady and reliable through the cold afternoon. The ranch came into view just as the sun touched the tops of the western ridges, that low, raking light that turns everything gold and hard-edged and makes even ugly things look like paintings. The cabin sat on a low bench above the creek, built from pine logs that had gone gray-brown over the years, solid and inelegant and clearly built by someone who cared more about function than appearances. There was a barn, a hay-storage shed, a chicken coop that leaned slightly to the left, and a corral with a fence line that needed 2 posts replaced on the south end. All of this was visible from the road. Eliza looked at it for a while without saying anything. I know it's not much, Gideon said before he could stop himself. She turned to look at him with a slightly surprised expression, like she hadn't expected him to be self-conscious about it. It's more than nothing, she said simply, which is what I had this morning. That settled that. Brant. The inside of the cabin was cleaner than she'd expected, which he noticed her noticing without comment. He was not a man who lived in disorder. Everything had a place. Everything was in it. But it was spare the way a place gets when it's been lived in by only one person for a long time, with no pictures on the walls and no curtains on the windows, and a quality of pure functionality that wasn't exactly cold, but was definitely incomplete. The second room was small. There was a rope bed frame against one wall, a wool blanket folded at the end of it, and a wood box with a candle stub on top. "I can get more blankets," he said. "There are 2 others in the chest at the end of my room." "This is fine." "It'll be cold tonight. The stove in the main room helps, but this one doesn't warm as fast as it should. I need to look at the chimney fitting. I've slept cold before." "I know. I'm saying I'll have it fixed by next week." She turned around and looked at him. This large, serious man who had just married her 6 hours ago, standing in a doorway too small for him, telling her he'd fix her chimney fitting. There was something so plainly genuine about it that it caught her somewhere unexpected. "Thank you," she said, and meant it. He nodded and left to tend the horses. She found the account books after supper. They were on a shelf above the table, 3 of them, the oldest going back 4 years, the most recent covering the current year. She took them all down while Gideon was outside bringing in wood, and sat down with the candle and opened the first one. She read for an hour while he sat across the table cleaning a bridle by lamplight, neither of them speaking. She turned pages. He worked the oil into the leather. Occasionally one of the dogs made a noise outside, and occasionally the fire popped. "You've been undercharging for freight work," she said, without looking up. He paused. "What?" "The freight work. The delivery runs you take in the summer." She tapped the page. "You've been charging flat rates that made sense 3 years ago and haven't adjusted for how prices have shifted. You've left somewhere between $15 and $20 on the table in the last 6 months alone." Gideon set down the bridle. "How can you tell that from the entries?" "Because you write down what you charge and what you carry, and I can work out the current market rate." She finally looked up. "This is what I'm good at, patterns and numbers. Most people can't see them. I always could, even as a kid." She paused. "My father used to say it was either a gift or a curse depending on whether you were the one looking at the books or the one being looked at." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "What else?" She turned back to the pages. "The feed purchase in August. You bought from Morrison's in Chalice. He's charging 11 cents more per bushel than the supplier in Salmon City. The extra ride's worth making if you're buying in volume." A pause while she turned another page. "And you've got a consistent overage on lamp oil that doesn't match usage. Either you have a slow leak somewhere you haven't found, or someone's helping themselves." "The hands," he said slowly. "I've had 2 seasonal men the last 3 summers. I hadn't thought to track it. You wouldn't necessarily notice unless you were watching the numbers over time." She closed the first book and opened the second. "I'm not criticizing. You've been doing this alone. It's hard to do alone." "Yes," he said. No defensiveness, just the plain truth of it. "It is." She looked at him across the table. He was watching her read with an expression that was difficult to name, not suspicious, not impressed exactly, but attentive in a way that felt genuine. "I'll have a full picture by the end of the week," she said. "Then we can talk about what to address first." "All right. The most important thing is the creek access," she said. "I noticed on the deed that the water rights are attached to the south quarter section. That's extremely valuable, probably the most valuable thing about this property, more than the grazing land." He went very still. Something shifted in his face. "Yes," he said. "You already know that." "I know it." He picked up the bridle again, but didn't start working it, just held it. "There's a woman, Vivian Crow. She runs the Crow operation northeast of here. She's been trying to acquire that water right for 2 years. She's offered to buy it twice, and I've refused twice." "What happened after you refused?" "The first time, nothing. The second time, I found 2 of my fence lines cut on the eastern boundary." He paused. "I can't prove she ordered it." Eliza was very still. "What does she want with the creek access specifically?" "There's a plan to run a larger cattle operation through the valley. She's already got 3 parcels. The water right on my land is the piece that makes the whole thing work. Without it, the scale she wants isn't possible." "And you won't sell." "This is my land," he said. It wasn't fierce, wasn't angry, just fundamental. "I built it. Thomas helped me build the first structure on it, before the cabin. I've kept it through 2 bad winters and 1 year of cattle disease that killed a third of my herd." He set the bridle down again. "I won't sell." Eliza looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked back down at the books. Then we'd better make sure everything is correct and documented, she said, because if she's persistent and she has money and she's not above cutting fence lines, she's going to find another angle to push. Probably, he said. What's the state of your legal documentation on the water right? Filed with the Territorial Land Office. Should be correct. Should be? I filed it myself. He stopped. I don't make mistakes with the land itself. The paperwork is another thing you're not good at. He nodded, not looking particularly ashamed of it. I'll look at the land records tomorrow, she said. When you go to Chalice next, I'll need you to pull a copy of the filed deed from the land office if you can. I want to see the original record. You think there's a problem? I think if someone wants your land badly enough and you're not watching the paper trail, problems have a way of appearing. She met his eyes. I'm watching now. He looked at her across the table. This woman he'd known for 30-some hours, sitting in his cabin by lamplight with her ink-stained cuff and his account books open in front of her, and something he hadn't felt in a very long time moved through him. Something cautious, quiet, and entirely unwelcome. He picked up the bridle and went back to work. The next 3 days settled into patterns. Gideon was up before first light, out in the yard while the stars were still hard and white above the ridge. Eliza heard him go. She was a light sleeper, and the cabin walls were solid but not silent, and lay in the dark for a few minutes before she got up herself. By the time he came in for breakfast, the stove was burning and the coffee was ready, which surprised him the first morning enough that he stood in the doorway for a moment before coming in. You don't have to do that, he said. I know. She handed him the coffee. Sit down. She'd found in the back of the pantry cabinet, enough to work with, dried beans, cornmeal, a side of salt pork, a small supply of actual flour. The pantry was not well organized. She reorganized it on the second day systematically while he was out working the south pasture fence, and when he came back in, he spent a full minute looking at the newly arranged shelves with a slightly bewildered expression. I can put it back if you prefer, she said. No. He looked at her. It's better this way. I know it's better. I just couldn't. He stopped. I couldn't make myself do it. You can't see the disorder when you're the one who created it, she said. It's normal. He looked at the pantry for another moment. The flour's almost gone. I'll need to bring more from town. Write it down on the list I started on the table. I'll have a full supply list together by Friday. He looked at the list. She'd already started it in her careful, small handwriting. He picked up the pencil and added flour, then set it down. You make lists, he said. Doesn't everyone? No. She shrugged. Then everyone is operating at a disadvantage. He was quiet for a beat, and then, so quietly she almost missed it, he made a sound that was very nearly a laugh. Not quite, but nearly. It was the first time she'd heard anything like it from him, and it caught her off guard enough that she turned away and busied herself with the stove to cover whatever expression was on her face. The dogs decided they liked her on the third day. Saber, the big brown and white one, started it by sitting beside her while she was at the desk and putting his chin on her knee, which she accepted without comment. Rook held out until the afternoon, when she was hanging laundry on the line Gideon had strung between two posts behind the cabin, and then appeared from nowhere with a wool glove in his mouth and dropped it at her feet. She looked at the glove. She looked at Rook, who looked back at her with the cheerful, uncomplicated confidence of a dog who has just done something socially successful. Is that his? She asked. Gideon, who was mending a piece of harness nearby, glanced over. Mine, actually. I've been looking for that. He brought it to me. He does that. Brings things he's stolen to people he likes. Gideon held out his hand and Rook trotted over and dropped the glove into it without any fuss. You should probably take it as a compliment. I'll try to, she said. She turned back to the laundry and after a moment added, For what it's worth, I've always been good with animals. I can see that, he said. Saber never sat beside anyone like that before. She said nothing, but she was aware of a small, quiet warmth somewhere in her chest that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. On the fifth night, something happened that she hadn't planned for. She was at the desk, working late by candlelight on a reconciliation of the past 2 years' cattle sales records, when she found an error. Not a small one. A repeating error in the way the herd numbers had been recorded that meant the actual inventory count was off. Not dramatically, but enough to affect any legal claim to herd size in the event of a dispute. She sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then she said, "Gideon." He was reading near the fire, or at least holding a book. She'd come to suspect he sometimes held books when he was actually just thinking. He looked up. "There's a problem," she said. He came to the desk and she showed him, laid it out plainly, the discrepancy and its implications. He bent over the page and studied it for a long time without speaking. His face in the candlelight was all planes and shadow, unreadable as usual. "You found this in 5 days," he said. "I was looking carefully. No one else has looked at these books in 6 years. He straightened up and looked at her. "How bad is it?" "It's fixable," she said. "It would take work, but it's fixable, and I can document the correction properly, so there's no question about the adjustment." She paused. "It means we need the original purchase records from at least 3 years ago. Do you have them?" "In the box under the bed." "Can I look at them tonight?" He went and got the box. They worked until nearly midnight, side by side at the uneven table, in a silence that was no longer careful. It was simply comfortable. The silence of two people doing something real together, with the fire burning down slowly, and the wind making its usual business outside and the dogs sleeping in a heap near the door. At some point, Eliza made a small mistake in an addition and caught it herself 2 lines later and said, quietly and with some feeling, a word that she immediately looked slightly embarrassed about. Gideon glanced up from the paper he was reading. "Agreed," he said. She looked at him. He looked back. And this time, when the thing that was almost a laugh happened, it happened fully. A short, quiet sound, but real. It was the first time she'd heard him actually laugh. She went back to her column. But something was different in the room after that, in a way she didn't try to name. Talk. By the end of the first week, the cabin smelled different. This was the thing Gideon noticed and didn't know what to do with. It smelled like cooking and laundry soap, and the particular lamp oil she'd found in the back of the supply shelf that she said was better quality than the other kind. Small things. Domestic things. Things that had been absent from the cabin for so long that their presence now felt strange, like walking into a room you've known all your life and finding the furniture rearranged. Not worse, just different. New. He was not a man who analyzed his feelings with any particular skill. He noticed them the way he noticed weather, when they were severe enough to require attention, and not much before. But he noticed on the 8th morning that he had lingered over breakfast longer than he needed to because she had been talking about the account books, and he had been watching her hands move when she spoke, and he had not wanted to stop watching them. He went out to the barn and stayed there for a while, doing unnecessary things with the harness, until the feeling settled. This was a practical arrangement. He had said so himself. She had agreed to those terms and was honoring them with everything she had. The last thing she needed was him confusing a business agreement with something it wasn't. He picked up the draw knife, the new one, the handle still pale and unscratched, and went out to the fence post that needed work. By the time he came back in at midday, he had himself sorted out again. Or at least, he thought he did. The letter arrived on a Friday. It came via a rider from Chalice, a boy of about 15 who handed it over with the incurious efficiency of someone who delivered enough mail not to wonder about its contents. The envelope was good paper, heavy. The writing on the outside was neat and authoritative. Gideon Mercer, Mercer Ranch, personal. He opened it at the table, with Eliza there, because he'd gotten out of the habit of reading things alone in just a week and noticed the change only after he'd already sat down across from her. "Mr. Mercer, I have been informed of your recent marriage. I offer my congratulations, though I confess some surprise at the timing. I am writing to renew, one final time, my offer to purchase the water rights attached to the south quarter section of your property. I believe my most recent offer was fair. I am prepared to increase it by 15%. This would represent a substantial sum, more than sufficient to establish a comfortable life elsewhere. I trust you will consider this offer seriously. The frontier is a difficult place, and I have found that those who try to hold on to more than is practical for their situation often find the difficulty increases considerably over time. With regards, Vivian Crow." He slid the letter across the table. Eliza read it. When she finished, she read it again, more slowly. Her face was quiet and entirely still. "The difficulty increases considerably over time," she said. "Yes." "That's a threat." "Yes." She set the letter down on the table and looked at it for another moment. Then she looked up at him. "Write back," she said. "Tell her no, short and direct. Don't explain, don't justify." He studied her. "She's not someone who accepts no easily." "I know." Eliza's voice was level. "I've dealt with people like her before. People who have enough money to turn patience into pressure. The only thing they understand is a wall." She looked at him steadily. "So we're the wall." Gideon looked at her across the table, at the set of her jaw and the absolute clarity in her dark eyes, and for the second time in a week felt something he wasn't prepared for. "All right," he said. He took the letter back, folded it, and set it aside. "One more thing," Eliza said. "What?" "I want to see the actual filed land record for the water right as soon as you can get it from the land office. Original filing, all amendments." She paused. "If she's been pressuring you legally for 2 years, the record is the first thing I'd look at if I were her." He looked at her for a long moment. "I'll ride to Chalice Monday," he said. She nodded and went back to the books. Outside, the first serious cold of the season was coming down from the north, the kind that carried winter in it, not just autumn. The horses in the corral felt it and moved restlessly. The creek ran low and steady below the bench, silver and cold in the afternoon light. The ranch sat quietly under the enormous sky. 2 people inside it who had arrived at an agreement and were, without quite meaning to, becoming something more. Neither of them was ready to say that yet. But the winter was coming, and there was a great deal of work to do, and sometimes the truth of a thing arrives quietly, in the ordinary hours before you've thought to look for it. The copy of the water rights filing came back from the land office on a Tuesday, tucked inside a leather courier envelope that Gideon dropped on the table without ceremony when he returned from Chalice. Eliza was in the middle of mending a split seam on a feed sack, not because it was her job specifically, but because she'd found it sitting on the floor and the waste of a good sack bothered her, and she set it down immediately and opened the envelope before he'd even gotten his coat off. She read standing up. He watched her read. "There's an amendment," she said. "I know there's an amendment. I filed it 2 years ago when I ran the new fence line. This amendment." She turned the page around so he could see it. "The language here. Look at the boundary description in the 3rd paragraph." He came and looked. The handwriting was the land clerk's, a man named Price, who'd been in that office for 8 years and was generally considered reliable. The boundary language described the water right as attached to the parcel commonly known as the South Quarter section, running to the creek's eastern bank as surveyed in the original filing of 1876. "What's wrong with it?" Gideon asked. "The original filing says western bank." She said it flat. "The creek runs along the western edge of your property. The water right is attached to the western bank, which is your land. If this amendment supersedes the original and describes the eastern bank," she stopped, "then the water right is attached to land I don't own. It might be argued that way." She set the paper down carefully, the way you set down something fragile. "It might be argued that way by someone with a good lawyer and a reason to argue it." The room was very quiet for a moment. "Price made a mistake," Gideon said slowly. "Or someone asked him to." He looked at her. "That's a serious thing to say." "I know it is." She met his eyes. "I'm not saying it lightly. I'm saying it because it's the possibility we have to consider." She picked the document back up. "The amendment was filed 14 months ago. When did Crow's second offer come in?" He thought about it. 13 months ago. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "I need to see the original 1876 filing," Eliza said. "The actual original, not a copy. Is it held in Chalice or was it sent to Boise?" "Boise, the territorial office." She pressed her lips together. Boise was not a quick ride. "Write to the territorial land office today. Request a certified copy of the original water rights filing. Do it in your name, keep it formal, don't explain why." She paused. "And don't go to Price. Don't let him know you've noticed." Gideon looked at her for a long moment. "You think like someone who's been in a fight before." "My father owed money to people who didn't want to be patient about it," she said simply. "I learned early that the paperwork is always where the danger is." He pulled out a chair and sat down at the table. "Hand me the pen." She handed it to him. The letter to the territorial office went out the next morning. November arrived like a door slamming shut. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in 2 days, the creek developed its first shelf of ice along the edges, and Gideon spent 4 days solid preparing the ranch for a winter that the sky was promising would be serious. He and Eliza worked in parallel, him handling the animals and structures, her managing every other thing that needed managing, and occasionally both of them working the same problem from different angles. The hay situation was the first real test. "We're short," she told him on a Wednesday morning, with the inventory figures in front of her. "Not catastrophically, but short enough that if this winter runs long, we'll be buying at bad prices in February." "I know," he said. He was at the table eating. She'd noticed he ate quickly and without much attention to the food, the way a man eats when he's been feeding himself alone long enough that meals are functional rather than anything else. "Morrison's has some, but his price is bad." "I found someone else." She turned her notes around. "A man named Headley, farming the bench land east of the river. He had a good hay year, and he's willing to sell at fair price before winter locks the road. I wrote to him yesterday." He looked at the note. Then he looked at her. "You wrote to him yesterday. Was that wrong?" "No." He looked back at the note. "How did you know about Headley?" "Mrs. Hutchins at the boarding house. She knows everyone's business. I wrote her after we arrived and asked her to send me whatever she knew about local suppliers." A pause. "I should have told you I was doing that." "It's fine." He set the note down. "It's more than fine. I didn't think of Headley." "You've been busy thinking about the fence line and the hay storage roof, which also needs attention." "The East End," he said. "I know. I'll get to it this week. I found the problem. It's the second rafter from the south end. There's rot at the base. I can show you." He stopped eating and looked at her fully. "You were up in the hay storage?" "I was doing an inventory." "You climbed the He stopped. Started again. "That ladder is not stable." "I know. I held on carefully." She met his eyes. "I grew up on a working property, Gideon. I know how to move around one without hurting myself." A complicated expression crossed his face, something caught between the instinct to say something protective and the knowledge that she would not receive it well, and the additional knowledge that she was probably right. He settled for, "The ladder's getting replaced before you go up there again." "That's reasonable," she said. "Thank you." He went back to eating, but the set of his shoulders had changed slightly. Something loosened in it, and she filed that away without examining it too closely. The Headley hay arrived 4 days later, enough to cover the shortfall, and Gideon paid for it at the price Eliza had negotiated, which was 15% below what Morrison would have charged. He didn't say anything about the saving, but that evening he came in from outside and set a small package on the desk beside where she was working. She looked at it. Plain paper wrapping, string tied around it. "What is this?" "Chalice. Last week." He was already moving toward the fire. "I saw it and thought you might want it." She unwrapped it. It was a bottle of ink. Good quality, dark black, not the watery pale stuff she'd been using from the single bottle she'd found in his supply shelf. She turned it in her hands. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know." He sat down. "You're going through the other kind fast. It makes your writing hard to read by the end of the bottle." She looked at the bottle for a moment. Then she set it beside the inkwell and said, "Thank you," and went back to work. It was not a large thing. She knew it was not a large thing. But that night, lying in her small room listening to the wind move across the roof, she thought about it longer than it deserved. The first time she met Vivian Crow in person was at the general store in Chalice, and it was not an accident on Vivian's part. Eliza had ridden in alone. Gideon was fixing the stable foundation with the seasonal hand, a quiet older man named Curtis who showed up in October and didn't ask for much, with the supply list and the errand of picking up Gideon's repaired draw knife from the hardware man. She was at the dry goods counter when the door opened and a woman came in who turned every head in the room without appearing to try. Vivian Crow was somewhere in her mid-40s, tall, dressed in a way that announced money without being flashy about it. A dark wool coat with good buttons, boots that had been resoled recently, hair arranged in the neat and confident style of a woman who has staff to help with such things. She was handsome in a strong-featured way, and she moved through the store the way people do when they're accustomed to rooms rearranging themselves around them. She stopped in front of Eliza with a smile that was perfectly calibrated, warm enough to be courteous, cool enough to establish something. "You must be Mrs. Mercer," she said. "I've been hoping to meet you. I'm Vivian Crow." "I know who you are," Eliza said. A slight pause, so brief most people would have missed it. "Of course. Small territory." Vivian tilted her head slightly. "I was sorry to hear about your father. Thomas Rowan was a remarkable man." "He was. I hope you found the adjustment to ranch life manageable. It can be quite difficult for someone coming from—" a small pause. "Different circumstances." "It's been fine," Eliza said. Vivian's smile didn't change, but her eyes did. A quick, assessing flicker, like she was recalibrating. "Gideon is a capable man, stubborn, but capable." She said it with the proprietary tone of someone who has known a person long enough to claim the right to describe them. "I've always respected that about him, even when we've disagreed." "Disagreed about the water rights," Eliza said. Another pause, longer this time. "Among other things." Vivian looked at her with something more genuine now, a kind of frank appraisal that was, in its way, more honest than the social performance that had preceded it. "You're direct. I find it saves time." "So do I." Vivian smiled, and this smile was slightly different, smaller, more real. "I think you and I might have gotten along well, under different circumstances." "Possibly," Eliza said, "under different circumstances." Vivian held her gaze for a moment, then looked at the counter, then back. "I hope Gideon reconsiders my offer. I mean that genuinely. The figure I've proposed is fair." "He won't reconsider it," Eliza said. "And neither will I." The air between them was very still. "Neither will you," Vivian repeated softly. "It's my property too," Eliza said. "My name is on the deed." Something moved behind Vivian's eyes. Surprise perhaps that Gideon would have agreed to that, and the rapid recalculation that followed. "Well," she said, "then I suppose the conversation continues." "I suppose it does," Eliza agreed. Vivian left without buying anything, which suggested she hadn't come to the store for supplies. Eliza picked up her dry goods, paid for them, and walked out into the cold Chalice afternoon. Her hands were steady. Her heart was going a little faster than normal, which she acknowledged and set aside. She'd handled worse than Vivian Crow, and she'd done it with fewer resources. When she told Gideon about the encounter that evening, he was quiet for a long time. "She came to look at you," he said finally. "I know." "What did you make of her?" Eliza thought about it honestly. "She's smart. She's used to getting what she wants, but she's not careless about how she gets it. She wanted to see if I was someone she needed to take seriously." A pause. "She decided I was." "How do you know?" "Because her smile changed." He looked at her. "People's smiles change when they stop performing and start actually paying attention," she said. She stopped performing about halfway through. He was quiet again. The fire popped. Rook lifted his head from the floor and then set it back down. "She'll push harder now," Gideon said. "Probably," Eliza agreed. So we make sure we're ready." The response from the Territorial Land Office arrived 2 weeks later. Eliza read it at the desk while Gideon stood behind her, reading over her shoulder. Something he'd started doing without comment, and she'd stopped noticing. The original 1876 filing described the water right as attached to the western bank of the creek. The amendment, as filed 14 months ago, described the eastern bank. The discrepancy was documented in black and white, one against the other. "It's wrong," Gideon said. "Yes. Price made an error, or someone helped him make it." She turned in her chair. "Either way, we have the original document now. We have proof the amendment contradicts the established record." She paused. "This is actually better than it looked. If Crow was planning to use the amendment as a legal lever, she's just lost that lever." He exhaled slowly. Not relief exactly. Something more like the recalibration of a man who'd been braced for a worse blow. "Can we file a correction?" "We can. I'll draft the correction letter and you sign it. We send it to the territorial office with copies to the county records." She looked at him steadily. "This needs to be done carefully, Gideon. The right language, the right documentation. If it's done right, the corrected record is airtight." "Can you do that?" "Yes." She said it without bravado, just fact. "I've done similar work before. Estate records for my father's acquaintances, deed transfers, one boundary dispute that his neighbor wanted to avoid paying to have resolved properly. A small, dry pause. It was a mess. This is cleaner. He looked at her for a moment. There was something in his expression that she'd been seeing more often lately. Not the cautious distance of those first days, but something quieter. Something that watched her in a way she didn't quite know what to do with. "All right," he said. "What do you need from me?" 2 hours of your time. Tonight, if you're not too tired." "I'm not too tired." They worked until almost 11. The correction letter, when they finished, was 6 pages long and referenced 4 separate documents, each cited precisely. Eliza read it back to him when they were done, paragraph by paragraph, and he listened with his elbows on the table and his face in his hands. Not distressed, she'd come to recognize, just the position he took when he was concentrating without wanting to appear to be concentrating. "It's right," he said when she finished. "Good. I'll copy it clean in the morning, and it goes out with Friday's rider." He stood and stretched, and she gathered the pages into order and set them beside the inkwell. The candle was burning low. Outside, the temperature had dropped another notch, and the creek, if you listened, was moving slower, more ice in it every day. "Eliza." He said her name the way he'd been saying it for a few weeks now, no longer with the slight formality of someone still learning the weight of a new thing, but easily, like it had settled into his vocabulary without ceremony. She looked up. This was... He stopped, tried again. "I don't know how long it would have taken me to find that discrepancy on my own." A pause. "Or if I would have." "You would have," she said. "Eventually. Maybe." He looked at the stack of documents. "But eventually is too late sometimes." She looked at him for a moment. He was not a man who said things he didn't mean. She'd established that much in 6 weeks. He was also not a man who said things easily. "That's what I'm here for," she said. Carefully. Not dismissively, but carefully, because they were still in the territory of practical arrangement, and she was not going to confuse herself about that. He nodded. He took his coat off the hook by the door, shook it once, hung it back up. A habit she'd noticed, the unnecessary adjustment before bed, and went to his room. She sat at the desk a few minutes longer, listening to the wind press against the walls. The ranch was not comfortable in the way that places are comfortable when people aren't trying very hard. It was comfortable in the specific way of things that have been worked for, the warmth of a stove that someone split wood for, the order of a pantry that someone reorganized, the security of documents that someone stayed up late to get right. That kind of comfortable was different, more solid, harder to take for granted. She blew out the candle and went to her room. The letter went out on Friday. Vivian Crow's legal leverage, such as it was, went with it. But neither of them were naive enough to believe that was the end of anything. A woman like Vivian Crow didn't retreat because one door closed. She found another door. Somewhere out in the dark of the Idaho winter, that other door was already being looked for, and neither Gideon nor Eliza knew yet what shape it would take when it arrived. They only knew it was coming. And for the first time since Eliza had stepped off a wagon with $14 and a dead man's letter, for the first time, she didn't feel like she was facing it alone. The correction letter reached the Territorial Land Office on a Thursday. By the following Monday, Vivian Crow knew about it. This was the kind of territory where information moved faster than horses when the right people were paying attention, and Vivian Crow was always paying attention. Nothing happened immediately. That was almost worse. December settled over the ranch like a physical weight. The cold was the serious kind now, the kind that killed things if you weren't careful. Froze water lines, stiffened joints in the cattle, made every outdoor task take twice as long because you had to keep stopping to work feeling back into your hands. Gideon was outside from first light until dark most days, and some days past dark, and Eliza kept the stove burning and the meals timed and the accounts current and tried not to think too much about the fact that Vivian Crow had gone quiet. Quiet was not reassuring. Quiet meant thinking. "She's not done," Eliza said one evening, not for the first time. "No," Gideon agreed, not for the first time. The legal angle's closed, or mostly closed. The amendment correction is filed. The original record is cited and documented. She turned her pen in her fingers. A habit he'd noticed, the way she held things when she was working through something. She'll try something else. "What?" "I don't know yet." She set the pen down. "That's what bothers me." He looked at her across the table. Weeks of shared evenings had made this ordinary. The two of them at the table after supper, him doing whatever needed doing by hand, her working through whatever needed working through on paper, the dogs in their usual places, the fire doing its job. Ordinary, and yet he was aware, lately, of being aware of it, of noticing the specific quality of the lamplight on her face when she was concentrating, the way she pressed her lips together when she found something in the numbers that displeased her, the particular silence she kept that was different from his silence, less empty somehow, more inhabited. He looked away before she looked up. "I'll have Curtis keep watch on the east fence line," he said. "After the cutting last year, it's the obvious target." "The barn too," she said. "The hay." He looked at her. "You think she'd go that far?" Eliza met his eyes. 2 years of legal pressure that hasn't worked. A land amendment that just got corrected and documented. A new variable, me, that she didn't account for. She paused. "If I were her, and I had already decided that I wanted this land badly enough to file a fraudulent amendment, I'd be thinking about how to hurt you where it costs the most." The hay barn. Everything they'd stored for the winter. The livestock's survival. "I'll talk to Curtis," he said. But Curtis was one man, and the nights were long, and neither of them slept as easily as they had before. The fire started at 2:30 in the morning on a Thursday in mid-December. Eliza woke to the smell first, not the familiar wood smoke of the stove, but something sharper, something with a chemical edge underneath it that pulled her out of sleep faster than any sound could have. She was on her feet before she was fully conscious, moving to the window, and what she saw through the glass turned everything in her chest to ice. The hay barn was lit up orange against the black sky, the light enormous and wrong in the way that fire always is at night. Too bright, too alive, eating the dark with a hunger that had nothing gentle in it. "Gideon." She was already in the main room, not yelling, but loud and direct. "Gideon, the barn." He came out of his room in 3 seconds flat, already pulling his boots on before he'd cleared the doorway, which told her he'd been a light sleeper for a long time, and probably had reasons for it she didn't know yet. He looked at the window and his face went very still, in the way that his face went still when something was serious. "Get the horses out of the corral," he said. "They'll panic. Can you do that?" "Yes." "Stay away from the barn itself, the roof will go fast." He was already out the door. She got her coat, her boots, her gloves, and was out in 15 seconds. The cold hit her like a wall, brutal, sharp, the air tasting of smoke already. And she ran for the corral without stopping to think about how frightened she was. Because frightened wasn't useful, and the horses needed moving now. The horses were already wild-eyed and circling. She got the gate open and went in among them, which was not a safe thing to do with panicking horses in the dark, and she knew it wasn't safe, but she got her hands on the nearest one, the big gray gelding Gideon used for heavy work, and talked to him low and steady, the nonsense words you use with animals when the words don't matter, but the sound does. And after a moment he settled enough to lead. The others followed, the way horses do, and she got them through the gate and around to the far side of the cabin where the firelight didn't reach them and the wind was coming from the other direction. By the time she'd secured them and come back around the cabin, Gideon had the bucket line going. But it was one man with 2 buckets and a burning barn, and they both knew within 30 seconds of looking at each other that the barn was already gone. The structure was too far into it. What he was doing now was keeping the fire from jumping to the hay shed and from there to the cabin, which was possible if the wind stayed from the north. She took the second bucket without being asked and worked beside him. They saved the hay shed. They saved the cabin. They lost the barn entirely. It took until nearly 4 in the morning for the fire to burn down enough that the immediate danger was past. By then, Curtis had appeared from the direction of his bunkhouse. He'd smelled the smoke late, too late. And the 3 of them stood in the freezing dark looking at what was left of the hay barn, which was the stone foundation and a few smoking uprights and a great deal of ash. Eliza was breathing hard. Her hands, when she looked at them, were shaking. Not from cold, she thought, though the cold was extreme. From something else. Gideon stood beside her and said nothing for a long time. His face in the fading firelight was the set, closed expression she'd seen in the beginning, the mask he wore when he needed to not feel something fully in the moment because the moment required functioning. "I'm sorry," Curtis said, quiet and miserable. "I didn't smell it until—" "It's not your fault," Gideon said, flat but not unkind. "Go get warm." We'll talk in the morning. Curtis went. They stood there. The wind was very cold. Somewhere in the dark, one of the displaced horses made a sound, and then was quiet. "Are you all right?" Gideon asked. He was looking at the remains of the barn, but the question was for her. Yes, she was. Shaken, cold, ash in her hair, but physically fine. "You?" "Fine." A pause. "It's going to be a problem," he said, still looking at the ruins. "The cattle need sheltered feed access through February at minimum. Rebuilding takes time and materials I don't have budgeted for." He said it plainly, not despairing, just accounting for what was. "It's going to be a serious problem." "I know." "We'll figure it out." She turned to look at him. His profile against the dark sky was exhausted and very certain at the same time. The face of someone who has had bad things happen before and has kept going anyway and expects to keep going now. "Gideon?" She said it quietly. "What? Did you leave any kerosene in the barn?" He was still for a beat. Then he turned and looked at her. "No," he said. "I keep the kerosene in the hay shed. I always have. Fire risk." "I know," she said. "That's what I thought." They looked at each other in the dark and the cold, and the thing that neither of them had said out loud since the fire started was now fully present between them. "I want to look at the foundation before the light goes," she said. "First thing tomorrow. Before anyone comes, if anyone comes." "Why before anyone comes?" "Because if there's evidence, it won't survive people walking through the site." She held his gaze. "I want to look at it before anyone else does." He was very still for a moment. Then, "All right." They went inside. Neither of them slept. At first light, they were at the ruins. The cold had done the one useful thing cold can do after a fire. It had kept the scene stable, slowed the deterioration of the ash and char, kept the ground hard enough that the evidence, if there was evidence, wouldn't have shifted much. Eliza moved carefully, not stepping into the ash field but circling the foundation, looking. Gideon watched her and watched the road. If someone was coming to look at the damage, and someone would come because news traveled, he wanted to know before they arrived. "Here," Eliza said. He came to where she was crouching at the southeast corner of the foundation, the corner farthest from the road. She was looking at the base of one of the surviving uprights, a 6-inch post that had burned down to about chest height but still stood because it was hardwood, and hardwood takes longer. She pointed, and he bent down and looked. The char pattern at the base of the post was different. He'd been in enough situations in his life that required reading landscapes to see what she was seeing. The burn had started hotter and faster at ground level in this corner, spreading outward rather than coming from above the way a hay fire typically moved. The base of the post was more deeply eaten than the post itself above it, which was the inverse of what you'd expect from a fire that started in dry hay overhead. And there, in a crack in the stone foundation, protected from the main burn by the angle of the upright above it, a dark stain, not water, not ordinary residue. "Don't touch it," she said, though he hadn't moved to. "Kerosene," he said. "Smells like it." She sat back on her heels. The fire started here, in this corner, low to the ground. Whoever set it used the foundation corner as a windbreak, so the initial flame had time to catch before anyone could see the glow from the cabin. She looked up at him. They knew the layout. "Someone who'd been on this property before," he said, "or been told about it in detail." She stood up. Her face was very calm in the way that her face got when she was angry, but needed to be useful. "We need to document this. Can you get paper and a pencil? I want to sketch the burn pattern while it's clear." "Eliza, "I know," she said. "I know what it means. I know who it points to." She met his eyes. "But knowing and being able to prove are two different things, and right now I need the documentation." He went and got the paper and pencil. She spent an hour at the site, sketching the burn pattern from 3 different angles, making notes on the location of the kerosene stain, noting the specific char depth at each corner compared to the southeast corner. Her handwriting was fast but legible, the notes precise in the way that someone writes when they're converting anger into method. He stood watch and let her work. When she was done, she folded the papers carefully and put them inside her coat, against her chest. "We need to talk to the sheriff," she said. "Alderman's in Chalice." "Then we go to Chalice." She looked at him. Today, Gideon. Not tomorrow. Today before any more time passes. The stain will fade, the pattern will get disturbed. I know. He looked at the ruins one more time. Then he looked at her. You don't have to come. I can go alone. I'm coming, she said. This is my property too, and I know how to present what we found in a way that will be taken seriously. He didn't argue. He'd stopped arguing with her on things she was clearly right about sometime around week 3, which was efficient even if it occasionally irritated him. Curtis can watch the cattle, he said. Give me 20 minutes to brief him. I'll get the horses ready. Sheriff Alderman was a deliberate man in his late 50s who had seen enough of the territory's particular variety of trouble to take most things seriously, but few things at face value. He listened to Gideon's account of the fire without interrupting, and then he read Eliza's documentation, all of it, slowly, turning each page with the careful attention of a man who understood that the paper in his hand might matter later. When he finished, he set the papers down on his desk and looked at both of them. You're saying it was set deliberately? Yes, Eliza said. And you're pointing at Vivian Crow. We're presenting what we found, Eliza said carefully. The burn pattern, the kerosene evidence, the location of origin. We're not naming anyone in this documentation. You'll notice that. We're presenting the physical facts. Alderman looked at her with something that might have been the beginning of respect. The physical facts do suggest deliberate ignition, he said. The location and the accelerant evidence are hard to explain otherwise. He leaned back. Hard to explain isn't the same as proof. I know, Eliza said, but it's the beginning of proof. And I think if you look at who had reason, who had means, and who has been applying pressure on this property for the better part of 2 years. I know Vivian Crow's history with the Mercer land, Alderman said, not unkindly. The whole territory knows it. Then you know the direction to look. He was quiet for a moment. She doesn't do things herself. That's not her method. No, Eliza agreed, which means someone was hired, which means there's a person who can be found and who knows who hired them. She paused. People who are hired to do things like this don't expect to be found, and when they are, they don't tend to stay loyal to the person who hired them, not if the alternative is worse. Alderman looked at her for a long moment, then he looked at Gideon. Where'd you find her? Chalice, Gideon said. Boarding house. Alderman picked up the documentation again. I'll need to come out to the site today, before dark. We'll take you back with us, Gideon said. Give me an hour to make arrangements. They waited in the cold outside the sheriff's office. The street in Chalice was doing its normal business, unhurried, indifferent to the fact that their barn was ash, and their winter security had just gotten considerably more complicated. Eliza stood with her hands in her coat pockets and looked at the mountains to the north, which were white and indifferent and enormous. You were right, Gideon said after a while. She looked at him, about anticipating it, about watching for it. He looked at the mountains too. I was watching the fence lines. I should have been watching the barn. You can't watch everything alone. No. A pause. That's the point, I suppose. She said nothing for a moment, then, we don't know yet that the evidence will be enough. Alderman's right that it points without proving. I know. But it's more than she expected us to have. Eliza looked at the sheriff's office door. She expected a burned barn and 2 people too overwhelmed by the loss to look carefully. She didn't expect anyone to be at the ruins at first light with a pencil and paper. No, Gideon said quietly. She didn't expect you. The words landed differently than either of them anticipated, and for a moment neither of them moved or spoke. The cold wind came down the street, and neither of them acknowledged it. I'll tell you something, Eliza said, and her voice was lower now, something stripped of its usual careful control. I am very tired of people underestimating what I can do. He turned and looked at her then, fully, directly, the way he had of looking at things when he decided they deserved his full attention. I know, he said. I know you are. And he meant it, she could tell. He meant it the way he meant everything he said, without decoration, without agenda, simply because it was true. She looked away first, back to the mountains, and breathed the cold air in slowly. An hour later, Sheriff Alderman came out of his office with his coat buttoned and his horse saddled, and the 3 of them rode back to the ranch through the sharp, bright December afternoon. The ruins of the barn were visible from the road as they came down the track, a dark scar on the white and brown landscape, ugly and deliberate. Alderman studied the site for 2 hours, made his own notes, and collected a sample of the stained stone from the southeast corner foundation. He said very little while he worked. When he was done, he stood at the edge of the ruins and looked at the damage with the particular expression of a man who has just concluded what he expected to conclude. "I'll make inquiries," he said, quietly. "There are men who take certain kinds of work in this territory, and I know most of their names." He looked at Gideon. "Don't touch the southeast corner of the foundation. Leave it as it is." "How long?" Gideon asked. "I don't know. A week? Maybe 2. Alderman mounted up. "Keep your doors locked and your eyes open, both of you." He rode back toward Chalice. They stood at the ruins in the failing afternoon light, the cold coming down hard off the mountains, the ranch quiet around them, the surviving structures, the cattle in the field, the hay they'd saved in the shed, everything that remained of a winter's careful preparation. "A week," Eliza said. "Maybe 2. Yes. That's a long time." "It is." Gideon turned and looked at the cabin, at the lights in the windows, at the smoke from the chimney that meant the stove was still working, at the dog sitting on the step looking at them with patient, uncomplicated expectation. "But we still have the hay. We still have the cattle, the cabin standing." He paused. "It's not good, but it's not finished." She looked at him for a moment, at the man who had been alone on this land for 6 years and who was still standing on it, with ash on his coat and exhaustion in his face and no intention whatsoever of leaving. "No," she said, "it's not finished." They walked back to the cabin together in the cold, and behind them the ruins of the barn settled further into the frozen ground, holding its evidence quietly, waiting for what came next. The week after the fire was the hardest kind of hard, not the dramatic, acute kind that you can push through on adrenaline, but the grinding, daily kind that asks something of you every single morning before you've finished your first cup of coffee. The cattle needed feeding from the hay shed in shifts now because there was no barn structure to bring them into. Gideon and Curtis worked out a rotation that was functional but exhausting, and the temperature dropped another 10 degrees the first week of waiting, which meant the outdoor work took everything the body had. Eliza managed the indoor operations and the finances and the communication and the watching, because someone had to watch, and she was better at watching than Curtis and less needed for the physical labor than Gideon. She wrote 3 letters that week. One to Pearl Hutchins in Chalice, asking for any information about strangers passing through or men known to take irregular employment. One to the Territorial Land Office, following up on the correction filing and requesting confirmation of the status. And one, the most carefully worded of the 3, to a land attorney in Boise named Garrett, whom she'd identified through the account books as having done legitimate survey work in the county 3 years prior, asking a series of precise questions about the legal standing of fraudulent land document amendments and the process for challenging them. She didn't tell Gideon about the 3rd letter until she'd already sent it. When she told him, he was quiet for a moment. A lawyer in Boise. A land attorney. There's a difference. Land attorneys know the territorial filing system specifically. If the amendment was manipulated deliberately, and if we can prove it, there may be grounds for a legal action that goes beyond the correction. She looked at him steadily. "I want to know our options before we need them." "That could get expensive." The consultation letter costs the price of postage. I asked specific questions that he can answer in writing. If we need him beyond that, she paused. "We'll deal with that when we know what we're dealing with." He looked at her for a moment. "You've been planning this since we found the burn pattern." "I've been thinking ahead since we found the burn pattern," she said. "That's different from planning. Planning requires knowing more than I know yet." He accepted that. He'd gotten better at accepting the way her mind worked, the constant forward movement of it, the habit of positioning herself 3 steps ahead of the current problem. He'd grown up thinking strategically about land and weather and cattle. She thought strategically about everything else, and between the 2 of them, they covered more ground than either could alone. He did not say this out loud, but he thought it with a clarity that was becoming harder to set aside. On the 9th day, Alderman came back. He arrived in the early afternoon, alone, on a horse that suggested he'd been riding for a while. He accepted coffee and stood at the table with his coat still on, which meant he wasn't staying long and had something to say. "I found the man," he said. Gideon set his cup down. Eliza looked up from the desk. "His name is Daltrey. He does rough work for hire, mostly out of the Lemhi Valley. I've had occasion to know his name for other reasons." Alderman's tone was the even, unemotional register of a man reporting facts that were ugly, but not surprising. "He's not a careful man. He talks when he drinks, and he drinks when he has money, and he had money recently." "Did he say where it came from?" Eliza asked. "He didn't say directly, but he has a pattern of working for one operation in this territory more than any other." Alderman looked at Gideon. "He's been on the Crow payroll before, twice that I know of, for fence work that didn't involve fences." "The cuts on my eastern boundary," Gideon said. "Last year." "Possibly. I can't prove that. What I can do is bring Daltrey in on the fire, because your evidence is solid and his recent cash is conspicuous." Alderman paused. "When I bring him in, he'll have a decision to make. What he knows about who hired him is the most valuable thing he has." "He'll give her up," Eliza said. "Not a question. I think he will. Men like Daltrey understand practical situations." Alderman finally took his coat off and sat down, which meant he was staying a little longer after all. "Here's what I need from you. I need your documentation. All of it. The burn pattern sketches, the kerosene location notes, the original water rights filing copy, and the corrected amendment, the full paper record of Crow's pressure on this property." Eliza was already at the document box. "I have it organized." "Of course you do," Alderman said, not unkindly. She brought the folder to the table and laid it out. Everything, in chronological order, each document labeled in her small, precise hand. The original land filing, the fraudulent amendment, the correction filing, the fence damage records Gideon had made at the time, the 2 letters from Crow requesting to purchase the water rights, and the burn pattern documentation from the morning after the fire. Alderman went through it page by page, and as he read, his expression shifted from the neutral official register to something with more weight in it. "This amendment," he said, holding up the page, "you have the original filing contradicting it, and you have the territorial office's confirmation of the discrepancy." "Certified copy," Eliza said. "Arrived 3 weeks ago. That's the original office seal on the bottom right." Alderman looked at the seal. Then he looked at Eliza with the full, evaluating attention he'd been parceling out in smaller amounts since they first came to his office. "You built this case," he said, "not just the fire, all of it." "We built it," she said. She glanced at Gideon. He knew what to protect. "I figured out how to protect it." Alderman gathered the papers carefully and put them back in order. "I'll keep these temporarily. I'll give you a written receipt before I leave." "Please," Eliza said. He wrote the receipt at the table. His handwriting, Eliza noticed, was better than most men in official positions. Deliberate, clear. He signed it and handed it to her, and she filed it immediately in the document box, which he also noticed. "One more thing," she said before he stood to leave. He waited. "The amendment to the water rights filing, if Daltrey gives us Crow, and if Crow directed the amendment, that's not just arson. That's deliberate manipulation of territorial land records, which is a different category of crime." She held his eyes. "I've written to a land attorney in Boise. I'd like to give him whatever Daltrey provides, in addition to what we already have." Alderman was quiet for a moment. "You're not just looking at putting her away for the fire. I'm looking at making sure she can't do this to anyone else," Eliza said. "Not on this land and not on any other land in this territory. The fire is what we can prove now. The land manipulation is what would have destroyed us quietly, over years, in a way that might never have been examined." A pause. "I want it all on record." Alderman looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Gideon. "You married a formidable woman," he said. "I'm aware," Gideon said. Daltrey broke in 2 days. Alderman brought him in on a Saturday, and by Sunday morning the man had given a full account in exchange for a reduced charge. Not immunity, Alderman made clear, but reduced. Daltrey was not loyal, as predicted. Vivian Crow had paid him $40 for the fire, with instructions delivered through an intermediary whose name Daltrey also provided, which was worse for Crow than if she'd delivered them herself. The intermediary was a man named Ferris, who managed the Crow operations logistics, and who, when Alderman arrived at the Crow Ranch on Monday with a deputy and the proper documentation, was found to be in possession of correspondence that should not have existed if the transaction had been properly covered. Vivian Crow, to her credit, didn't panic visibly. She received Alderman in her front room with the composure of a woman who had prepared herself for the possibility of this moment, and she said very little without her lawyer present, which Alderman had expected. What she hadn't prepared for was the land record evidence. The letter from the Boise attorney arrived on the same Wednesday that Alderman served Vivian Crow with formal notice of investigation. Eliza read it at the desk and then read it again, and then sat very still for a moment. "What does it say?" Gideon asked. He'd come in from outside and was standing by the door reading her face. She looked up. "It says the fraudulent amendment to the territorial land record constitutes criminal interference with government documents under the Territorial Code of 1878. It says, if we can demonstrate that the amendment was filed with deliberate intent to deceive, which our evidence supports, the filing clerk is also potentially liable, depending on his level of involvement." She paused. "It says if Crow directed it, she can be charged with the document fraud separately from the arson. 2 separate proceedings." Gideon was still. "It also says," Eliza continued, "that the land attorney is willing to take the case on a contingency arrangement, given the strength of the documentation." She set the letter down. "Which means we don't pay him unless we win." "That's—" Gideon stopped. "Yes," she said. He came to the table and sat down and looked at the letter. "You thought of this months ago, the documentation, the certified copy from the territorial office." "I thought something might come," she said. "I didn't know what form it would take, but I knew the paper trail was where the real fight would happen, so I built the paper trail." She looked at her hands on the table. "My father always said, if you want to protect something, don't just stand in front of it. Document it, record it, make it visible." Gideon was quiet for a moment. He was right. He usually was. A small pause. About the important things. He looked at her, at the ink-stained cuff, at the careful organization of the desk, at the woman who had arrived at his door with $14 and had spent the months since building a fortress out of paperwork and clear thinking. Something moved through him that he'd been navigating around for weeks, something large and inconvenient and entirely real. He didn't say anything about it. "Write to Garrett," he said. "Tell him to proceed." She picked up the pen. "Det." The weeks that followed were not quiet, but they were productive in the particular way that the momentum of justice produces when the evidence is solid and the documentation is thorough. Alderman worked the arson case with the steady competence of a man who understood that it needed to be airtight, and Eliza fed him additional supporting material, twice more, as she found it. Cross-referenced financial records from the Crow operation's publicly available land filings that showed a pattern of acquisition through pressure. 2 other properties before Gideon's where owners had experienced unexplained setbacks and subsequently sold. She found this in the territorial land records, which she'd requested in bulk from the Boise office, and she spent 3 evenings going through them at the kitchen table while Gideon sat across from her and said nothing but occasionally refilled her coffee, which was the kind of support that she found, unexpectedly, more useful than almost anything else. "There's a woman in Lemhi County," she said on the second evening, "a widow named Anders. She owned a parcel with a good water table. She sold it to Crow 2 years ago, 6 months after her barn burned." Gideon looked up. "And a family in the Passamaroy Valley. They left the territory entirely after a legal dispute over their boundary line that turned out to be based on a surveying record that doesn't match any other survey in the area." She set the page down. "Daltrey, or someone like Daltrey, and a filing clerk who made convenient errors." "Price," Gideon said. "Possibly Price or another one. I don't know yet." She looked at him across the table. "This is bigger than our land. She's been doing this for years. We're just the first people who didn't move or sell." "Because you were watching the paper trail." "Because we were both paying attention," she said. "You knew enough to be suspicious. I knew how to find the evidence. Neither of us alone—" She stopped. "Neither of us alone," he repeated. The room was very quiet. The fire had burned down and neither of them had gotten up to add wood, and it was getting colder, but neither of them moved. "I'm going to send this to Garrett," she said. "The Anders case and the Passamaroy family. If he can contact them, Their accounts corroborate the pattern. It strengthens everything. Do it, he said. She added it to the letter she was drafting. Her hand was steady. Her face was focused and fierce in the way it got when she was angry and doing something about it. He watched her write and told himself, again, that this was a practical arrangement. He was getting less convincing on this point, and he knew it. The public proceeding against Vivian Crow began on a Friday in late January in the county courthouse in Chalice, and by Saturday it was the only thing anyone in the territory was talking about. Gideon and Eliza rode in together on Friday morning. She wore her best dress, which was a deep blue wool that she'd repaired the hem on the week before, and she carried the document case that held their records. The originals now returned by aldermen, and copies of everything sent to Garrett. She looked, he thought, like a woman walking into a room she'd already decided to own. He wore his good coat. His boots were clean. The courthouse was full. This was the kind of proceeding that drew people. Vivian Crow had been a powerful presence in the territory long enough that watching her power come into question was an event. People came from 2 valleys over. Mrs. Pearl Hutchins was in the 3rd row, upright and attentive, and absolutely not hiding the fact that she was there to see every moment of it. Vivian Crow sat at the respondent's table with her attorney, a competent man from Boise who was competent enough to know what the documents in Eliza's case meant for his client. She was dressed well and composed, and she did not look at Gideon when he came in, but she looked at Eliza briefly, directly. Eliza looked back. Neither of them looked away first. It was a draw. The proceedings were orderly and took most of the day. Aldermen presented the arson evidence. The land attorney Garrett, who had traveled from Boise and proved in person to be a thin, precise man with very good instincts, presented the document fraud evidence. Daltrey testified, poorly but usefully. The intermediary Ferris testified better because he had less loyalty and more fear. Eliza was called to give an account of the documentary evidence she had compiled, and she did so from the stand with the same calm, systematic clarity she brought to everything. Facts in order, dates precise, sources cited, nothing embellished, nothing left out. She was in the witness chair for 40 minutes. When she came down, she sat beside Gideon, and he said nothing, but he shifted slightly in his seat so his shoulder was closer to hers, which was the closest thing to an expression of feeling he had managed in a public room in a long time. She noticed. She didn't comment on it, but she noticed. The verdict on the arson charge was delivered before close of day. The evidence was too clean for extended deliberation. Criminal incitement to arson, with sufficient evidence of direction and payment to hold Crow responsible. The document fraud charge was referred to the territorial court in Boise, given its scope and the involvement of the territorial filing office. Vivian Crow was still composed when the verdict was read. She was composed when she spoke briefly to her attorney. She was composed all the way to the door. At the door she paused and looked back at Gideon, a long, direct look with no performance in it, just the honest acknowledgement of someone who is lost and knows it fully. Then she looked at Eliza. "I underestimated you," she said, quiet enough that only a few people near the door caught it. "Yes," Eliza said. "You did." Vivian Crow went out. Outside the courthouse, the January afternoon was sharp and cold, and the mountains to the north were white all the way down to the tree line. People milled around, talking in the way people do when they've witnessed something significant and need to process it in groups. Pearl Hutchins found them on the steps and hugged Eliza with the straightforward warmth of a woman who had decided months ago that this particular young woman deserved better than she'd been given. And Eliza held on for a moment longer than she probably meant to. Gideon stood slightly apart, watching. His face was doing the thing where it didn't show what was happening, but Eliza, who had now been reading him for 3 months, could see through the surface of it to the exhausted, steady relief underneath. She went to stand beside him when Pearl released her. "It's not finished," he said. "The Boise proceeding will take time," she agreed, "but the record is built. Garrett knows what he's doing." She looked at the mountains. "The immediate fight is done." He was quiet for a moment. "The barn," he said. "I've been pricing the lumber. If we start building in March, when the ground's accessible—" "I've already run the numbers," she said. "We can do it. It'll be tight, but we can do it." He turned and looked at her. "Of course you've run the numbers." "Someone has to." "Yes." He held her gaze. Something in his expression had shifted. Or maybe it had been shifting for months and was only now fully visible. Eliza. What? He looked at her for a long moment. At the woman who had come to his door with nothing and had spent the months since building something out of intelligence and stubbornness and careful, relentless attention. At the woman who had stood at the ruins of his barn at first light with a pencil and paper, who had sat up until midnight documenting water rights, who had faced Vivian Crow in a courthouse without flinching. "Thank you," he said. It was insufficient, and he knew it, but he meant it with everything in him, which was the only currency he had. She looked at him. Her chin was at the angle that meant she was feeling something she was deciding whether to show. "Don't thank me," she said. "It's my land, too." But something in the way she said it, the slight catch underneath the steadiness, told him she understood that he wasn't just thanking her for the land. They rode back to the ranch in the late afternoon light, side by side on the road they'd traveled dozens of times in 3 months, the horses steady, the cold pressing in from the mountains. The ruins of the barn were visible when they came down the final track, still a scar, still evidence of what had been done. But beside them, the cabin lights were warm in the windows, and the hay shed stood solid, and the creek ran low and cold along the western boundary, catching the last of the daylight. Their land. Both their names on the deed. Eliza looked at the ruins, and then at the cabin, and then at the creek, and she thought of her father's letter, and the $14, and the boarding house room where she'd been trying to figure out how the math of survival could possibly work in her favor. The math had worked out differently than she'd calculated. She thought Thomas Rowan might have known it would. Gideon dismounted at the corral and took her horse's reins without being asked, and she let him and walked to the cabin door. The dogs came around the corner, saw Saber's tail going, Rook with something in his mouth that was probably a glove. She held out her hand and Rook dropped it in. Her glove this time. "He's getting better," she said. "He's really not," Gideon said from the corral. She laughed. Fully, genuinely. The kind of laugh that arrives when you're too tired to manage your reactions anymore. It surprised her. It surprised him, too. She could tell from the way he went briefly still. She went inside and put the glove on the hook by the door and started the stove. Outside, the Idaho winter sat heavy and cold and honest over the land. And somewhere to the east, Vivian Crow was making arrangements that would take her away from this territory for good. And in Chalice, people were talking. And in Boise, a land attorney named Garrett was preparing a case that would eventually reach people who had been wronged the same way, in the same pattern, and give them something they'd stopped believing they could have. And on the Mercer Ranch, the stove was warm, and the accounts were current, and the land was documented and legally sound in every way that mattered. And two people who had arrived at a practical arrangement were somewhere past the point where practical was an accurate description. Neither of them had said so yet. But the winter was almost done, and spring, with everything it brings and everything it asks, was only weeks away. March came in sideways, the way it always does in Idaho. Not the clean arrival of spring that people in gentler places expect, but an argument between seasons that neither side wins cleanly. There were 3 more hard freezes after the courthouse day in January, one brief thaw that turned the track to the road into something that swallowed a wagon wheel to the axle, and then a week of snow that came down soft and heavy and covered the ruins of the barn like a consideration. Gideon spent those weeks doing the work that winter allows, repairs that couldn't happen in summer's pace, maintenance on equipment, the slow rebuilding of the hay shed's interior shelving that the fire's heat had warped along the south wall. He worked methodically, which was the only way he knew how to work, and Eliza watched him from the cabin window sometimes and thought about the particular stubbornness of a man who treats a burned barn not as a defeat, but as a construction problem with a delayed start date. She had her own work. The Boise proceeding was moving slowly, but moving. Garrett wrote monthly with updates, his letters precise and thorough, and she wrote back with additional documentation twice, pulling records she'd cross-referenced from the territorial land files that added detail to the pattern they were building. The Anders widow in Lemhi County had responded to Garrett's outreach. So had the family from the Pasimeroi Valley. They'd left the territory, but they had records, and records were what the case needed. She worked on these things in the evenings, at the uneven table that had stopped being just his table somewhere around the 2nd month, and Gideon sat across from her and read or worked leather, or sometimes just sat, which she'd long since stopped interpreting as indifference and understood now as the particular kind of presence he offered. Steady, unhurried, there. It was a strange thing, she thought sometimes, what you could get used to without noticing you were getting used to it. The lumber arrived the second week of March, when the ground had finally committed to something resembling thaw. Gideon had ordered it from a mill in Salmon City. Better quality than Chalice carried, a longer haul, but worth it for the framing timber. The freight wagon came up the track on a Tuesday morning, and Eliza stood on the cabin steps watching 3 men unload it into the space where the barn had been, the new lumber pale and clean-smelling against the still visible char marks on the foundation stone. Curtis was there. 2 neighboring ranchers had shown up as well, without being asked, a man named Beaumont from the valley's eastern bench and his adult son, who simply arrived at 7 in the morning with their tools and didn't make a speech about it. Gideon shook Beaumont's hand and said, "You didn't have to." "I know," Beaumont said. "My barn burned 8 years ago. Your wife sent food the next morning. Never forgot it." He looked at Eliza on the steps. That was a different wife, of course, but the ranch is the ranch. Gideon looked at Eliza. She'd already gone back inside to start more coffee, which was the correct response to 4 extra men arriving to work. "Get your hammer," Beaumont said. "Daylight's burning." "What?" It took 11 days to frame and raise the new barn. Not 11 straight days, but weather interrupted twice, and there was a problem with the second course of the north wall that required tearing out a section and starting over, which Gideon took with an equanimity that Eliza had come to recognize as his version of intense frustration. He didn't yell. He went very quiet, walked away from the wall, stood at the creek for about 4 minutes, and came back and started pulling the bad section without speaking to anyone. She brought him coffee during that particular afternoon, just set it on the post beside him without comment, and went back to the cabin. He drank it. The wall got fixed. On the evening of the 11th day, the structure was standing. Not finished, the interior work still to come, but standing solid and square against the Idaho sky, smelling of new pine. The roof line straight. Beaumont and his son had gone home. Curtis was at the bunkhouse. Gideon stood at the edge of the foundation looking up at the frame in the late light. Eliza came to stand beside him. "It's bigger than the old one," she said. "Little bit." He looked at the roof line. "I adjusted the plans. We needed more storage capacity if we're expanding the herd next year." She turned to look at him. "You're planning to expand the herd. If the finances support it." A pause. "Do they?" "I'll look at the numbers this week." She looked back at the barn. "Probably yes, if we time the purchase right." He nodded slowly. The satisfaction in his face was quiet, the kind that doesn't announce itself, just sits there, earned. Good. They stood there in the cooling evening air, looking at the thing they had rebuilt, and it occurred to Eliza, with a clarity she hadn't been prepared for, that this was no longer a property she was helping to manage. It was hers in the way that places become yours, not just through the legal fact of a name on a deed, but through the particular accumulation of invested days, through the reorganized pantry and the corrected land records and the letters written by candlelight and the hours at the ruins in the cold with a pencil and paper, through the coffee brought to a man rebuilding a wall who would never ask for it but needed it anyway. She wasn't sure when that had happened. She was quite sure it had. The letter from Garrett arrived on a Thursday in early April, and it was the letter they'd been waiting for. The territorial court in Boise had ruled on the document fraud proceeding. The amendment to the water rights filing was formally declared fraudulent and struck from the territorial record. The original 1876 filing stood as the governing document, Western Bank, Mercer Land, exactly as it had always been. The land clerk Price had been removed from his position and was under separate inquiry. 2 additional cases, the Anders property in Lemhi County and the Pasimeroy family's boundary dispute, had been reopened based on the pattern evidence submitted by Garrett's office. And Vivian Crow, facing the compound weight of the arson conviction, the document fraud ruling, and the investigation into the broader pattern of land manipulation, had made a decision that people with enough money sometimes make when the territory turns against them entirely. She was liquidating her holdings. She was leaving. Eliza read the letter twice. Then she set it on the table and sat back and looked at the ceiling. Gideon came in from outside, saw her face, and stopped. What? She held out the letter. He read it. He read it slower than she had, the way he read everything, thoroughly, making sure he had it right. When he finished, he set it down. He didn't say anything for a moment. The silence was the kind that follows something you've been fighting toward for so long that its arrival doesn't produce relief as much as a sudden absence of tension, like a rope that's been pulled taut for months, finally going slack. It's done, he said. The arson conviction stands. The land record is clean. The water right is ours, documented correctly, no ambiguity. Eliza looked at the letter on the table. Garrett says the Anders widow may be able to reclaim her property. Crow's selling it as part of the liquidation, and Garrett's filing for a priority claim on her behalf based on the fraud evidence. That's... Gideon stopped. That's more than we set out to do. Yes. She looked up at him. I know. But the pattern was there. Once we found it, it seemed wrong not to. A pause. My father would have done the same. He would have, Gideon said. He was looking at her with the expression she'd been noticing more frequently in recent weeks, the one she'd learned to recognize and then deliberately not examine too closely, because examining it felt like moving toward something that couldn't be moved toward casually. His face was open in a way it almost never was, the careful guardedness that he wore like a second coat set aside, and what was underneath it was... She looked at the letter. We should write back to Garrett, she said. Thank him, and ask about the timeline for the final filing confirmation. Eliza. Something in the way he said her name, without prefix, without preamble, with a weight to it that was different from the ordinary use, made her stop. She looked at him. He was standing on the other side of the table, which was where he always stood, the uneven table between them like it had been since the beginning. That first evening with the account books, the late nights with the land records, all the months of sitting across from each other in the lamplight working on the practical business of survival. I have something to say, he said. I've been trying to figure out how to say it for a while. All right. I'm not... He stopped. Started again. I'm not a man who talks about things easily. You know that. I know that. So I want you to understand that what I'm about to say took some working up to, and I'd appreciate if you didn't interrupt me in the middle of it. Something moved through her chest, warm and complicated and not entirely comfortable. I won't interrupt. He looked at her steadily. When you showed up in Chalice, I told myself it was a practical arrangement, that I was solving a problem, yours and mine both. And that was true. But it stopped being the whole truth somewhere around the time you climbed an unstable ladder to do a hay storage inventory. And I've been carrying the rest of it around since then without knowing what to do with it. She was very still. You're the most capable person I've ever shared space with, he said. And I've shared space with capable people. You're not easy, which I told you in the beginning, and I meant it as a fair warning, but it turned out to be the thing He stopped again. The muscle in his jaw worked. I don't want a practical arrangement, Eliza. I want the actual thing. And I know that wasn't the agreement. I know you came here with nothing, and that changes the shape of what a person can choose freely. So I'm not asking you to feel something you don't feel. I'm done pretending I don't feel it. The room was very quiet. She looked at him across the table. This large, serious, difficult man who had offered her a practical arrangement and kept every term of it with absolute fidelity, who had never once used the asymmetry of their situation to push anything, who had brought her a bottle of good ink and fixed her chimney fitting and stood watch while she documented a crime scene and never once asked her to be less than she was. You're an idiot, she said. He blinked. I have been waiting, she said with some feeling, for approximately 3 months for you to say something like that. I had nearly concluded that you were constitutionally incapable of it. I'm slow, he said after a moment. You're very slow. I know. The ink, she said. In October. You went back to Chalice for lamp oil and oat sacks, and you came back with a bottle of good ink, and you said you thought I might want it. She looked at him. Gideon, I knew then. He was quiet for a moment. You knew then, and you said nothing. You said nothing. I was following your pace. My pace is extremely slow, she confirmed. Something shifted in his face. The almost laugh that had become fully a laugh somewhere over the winter, genuine and rare, and when it happened, worth everything that preceded it. He came around the table, not quickly, not with any of the dramatic urgency of men in stories, but simply and directly, the way he did most things. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she had to look up to see his face. "I love you," he said. No decoration, no ceremony, just the flat, certain truth of it, offered the way he offered everything. Without performance, because he didn't know how to perform things, which was the thing about him she'd been trusting since the beginning. She looked at him for a moment, at the face she'd been reading for months, the jaw and the careful eyes, and the particular stillness that wasn't coldness, had never been coldness, but was the specific quality of a man who has very few things to give, but gives them entirely. "I know," she said. "I love you too. I have for a while." He put his hand against the side of her face, and she let him, and the uneven table, and the account books, and the document case, and all the careful architecture of their practical arrangement sat around them, necessary and real, and already transformed into something that contained more than it had started with. It was not a perfect moment. The cabin was cold on one side because the stove needed wood and neither of them had added it. Rook was scratching at the door, wanting to come in. The new barn outside was only framed, not finished. There were still letters to write to Garrett and numbers to run on the herd expansion and a spring planting that needed planning. Life, in other words, was still entirely itself, demanding and imperfect and fully present. They stood in it, and it was enough. Spring came properly in late April. Not the polite suggestion of it, but the real version. The kind that turns the creek loud and the pasture green almost overnight. That brings the meadowlarks back to the fence posts and makes the horses restless with something that isn't quite joy, but is close to it. Gideon finished the barn interior the third week of April, with Curtis and Beaumont's son for the heavy work, and on the day they moved the first cattle into the new structure, Eliza stood at the corral fence and watched him move among the animals with the ease of someone entirely at home in the work he has chosen, and she felt something she'd felt rarely in her life, and had stopped expecting. Settled. Not comfortable in the way of people who have given up wanting more. Settled in the way of someone who has found the place where their particular combination of skills and stubbornness and capacity for work is actually useful, actually needed. Her father had wanted that for her. She understood it now in a way she hadn't when she'd stood at the boarding house window in October trying to figure out the math of survival. The math had never been the point. The math was just the door. May brought visitors. Pearl Hutchins came out from Chalice with a wagon of preserves and the unabashed curiosity of a woman who had invested emotional interest in this marriage from the moment she'd witnessed it and felt entitled to check on her investment. She arrived on a Saturday morning and spent 3 hours in the cabin talking with Eliza about the land case and the Boise proceeding and the general state of the territory's news, and she ate 2 plates of the stew Eliza made for lunch and pronounced it much better than anything she'd have expected, which Eliza took as the particular compliment Pearl intended it to be. She also looked at the new barn, the reorganized vegetable plot Eliza had started behind the cabin, and the general state of the property with the assessing eye of a woman who has seen many households and knows the difference between a place being kept and a place being made. "You've done something with this ranch," she said to Eliza, in the private moment while Gideon was showing Pearl's driver where to water the horses. "We've done something with it," Eliza said. Pearl looked at her. "You know what I mean." Eliza looked at the vegetable plot, the turned earth, the neat rows she'd laid out with stakes and string, the asparagus crown she'd ordered from a seed catalog in February. "My father brought me here," she said. "He knew what he was doing. Smart man, your father. The smartest I knew, until recently." Pearl made a sound that was satisfied and said nothing more on the subject, which was the right response. Beaumont started bringing his ranch hands over on occasional Sundays when Eliza had extra bread, which she'd begun baking on Saturdays as an act of pure practicality. The oven was going anyway, and which produced more than 2 people could use. Word of this spread in the informal way that word spreads in isolated communities, and within a month there were 4 or 5 regulars making the ride on Sunday afternoons. Curtis, Beaumont's son, a young couple named Pratt, who were homesteading the old Morrison claim 2 miles east, and were, as Eliza observed, in the specific desperate state of people in their first year of frontier farming who are surviving but only barely. She started setting more aside for them without making it obvious. Extra salt pork, a jar of preserves, the second half of a pie. She didn't announce it, and Gideon didn't comment on it, but one evening she caught him watching her pack up the Pratt share with an expression she'd learned to read, the one where he was moved by something and was deciding not to say so because saying so would embarrass them both. "The Pratts won't make it through next winter if they don't get their hay situation sorted," she said, without turning around. "I know," he said. "I told them about Headley." She sealed the jar. "And I gave Mrs. Pratt the supplier account I set up in Salmon City. The prices are better, and Headley's agreed to hold a small reserve for neighboring farms if I vouch for them." He was quiet for a moment. "You vouched for them. They're good people. They're just new." She turned around. "You were new once. I had Thomas Rowan. And they have us," she said. It came out more simply than she'd planned, the U.S. natural in it the way it had become natural in almost everything they discussed now. He heard it. She could tell from the slight shift in his face, and absorbed it quietly, the way he absorbed most things that mattered. "All right," he said. He went and found a length of spare rope the Pratt boy had been looking at and handed it over when they left, without ceremony, the way Beaumont's son had shown up with a hammer on barn-building morning. The frontier had its own economy of gesture, and Gideon had always understood it even when he'd practiced it alone. Practicing it with someone else was different, better. He was getting used to better. The final letter from Garrett came in June. The territorial court had issued its closing summary on the Crow proceedings. The document fraud conviction was confirmed. The water rights record was certified clean and correct in the territorial archive. The Crow holdings in the territory, the 3 parcels acquired through pressure, the main operation, had been sold. Vivian Crow had left Idaho Territory in April, and her current location was not the court's concern. The Anders widow had filed a successful claim on her property. The Pasimero family had received a settlement. 2 additional families discovered in the deeper investigation had received official acknowledgement of the fraud that had displaced them, which wasn't everything they'd lost, but was something. The formal record correcting itself, saying, "This was wrong, and we know it was wrong, and it is written down that it was wrong." Garrett's letter ended with a single additional paragraph that Eliza read 3 times. "I have practiced land law in this territory for 14 years. The case we built together is, I believe, the most thoroughly documented private land rights challenge I have handled in that time. The quality and precision of the documentary evidence you compiled made the difference between a difficult case and a decisive one. It has been a privilege to work alongside your efforts." She set the letter down. Gideon was outside. She could hear him. The particular rhythm of post-hole work, the effort, and the pause. She went to the door and stood in it, looking out at the June afternoon, at the green of the pasture and the new barn solid against the sky, and the creek running full and cold along the western boundary where it had always run, where it would continue to run, where it was legally and permanently theirs. "Gideon." He stopped and looked at her from across the yard. She held up the letter. He came, took it, read it. She watched his face while he read. The face she knew now with the thoroughness of months of close attention, all its particular tells and registers, the slight tightening around the eyes when he was reading something carefully, the way his jaw shifted when he reached something significant. When he finished, he looked up. "It's done," she said. "Yes." She looked at the creek. "My father asked you to protect me," she said. "That was what the letter said. He asked you to protect me." "Yes," Gideon said. "I've been thinking about that." She turned to look at him. "He knew you. He knew what you were. And he knew me. He knew I wouldn't accept protection I hadn't earned and wouldn't want help that came with condescension attached to it." She paused. "He knew that if he put the 2 of us in the same space, we'd figure out the rest ourselves. He wasn't asking you to take care of me. He was asking you to give me a fair chance." Gideon was quiet for a moment. Yes," he said. "I think that's exactly what he was doing." "He was smarter than either of us," she said. "He was," Gideon agreed. "He usually was." She looked at the letter in his hands. He would have been insufferable about this, about being right. Incredibly insufferable, Gideon said. And this time the laugh came easily. No build-up, no almost, just real, and hers, and easy between them the way things get when you've stopped managing the distance. There is a particular kind of life that doesn't announce its own value. It doesn't arrive fully formed or resolve itself into something you can frame and hang on a wall. It builds in the accumulation of daily things, in decisions made under pressure and problems solved by the particular combination of what two different people happen to be good at, in the specific comfort of someone who knows how you think and doesn't require you to be other than you are. Eliza Mercer, she had her name on the deed and used both parts of it without apology, understood this in a way she hadn't at 24, standing at a boarding house window with $14 and a dead man's letter and a very unclear idea of what came next. What she knew now, the math of survival is never just math. The practical arrangement is never just practical. And the person who shows up at your door when you have nothing and offers you fair terms and keeps every one of them, that person is worth more than any calculation you can put together. And recognizing that is not weakness. It is, in fact, the most accurate accounting you will ever do. What Gideon Mercer understood, at 36 for the first time, that the life he'd been living alone and calling it sufficient had been, in fact, the life of someone waiting without knowing they were waiting. That capable isn't the same as complete. That you can build something solid and good entirely by yourself, and it will still be quieter than it needs to be. And the quiet will feel normal until it doesn't anymore. He'd spent 6 years not knowing what he was missing. He'd known for months now, which was its own form of education. The Sunday gathering grew through June and into July. Eliza started a kitchen garden that produced more than she planned, partly because she'd underestimated how productive the soil was with the creek water she ran through it, and partly because she had a tendency to plant optimistically and then be obligated by her own investment to make it work. The excess went to the Pratts and to Curtis and to whoever happened to be on the property when the beans came in all at once and needed immediate handling. It became, without anyone deciding it would, the kind of place that people stopped by. Not just Sundays, a rancher from the northern bench with a question about the Salmon City supplier, Pearl Hutchins, with news from Chalice, Beaumont with an opinion about the summer grazing rotation that he wanted to run by Gideon. The Pratt wife, alone one afternoon, who sat at the uneven table and cried briefly about how hard the first year had been, and who Eliza sat with without trying to fix it, just present, making tea, letting it be hard out loud for a few minutes before the woman straightened up and said she was fine, and went home with 3 jars of preserves and a list of things that Eliza had learned the first winter that nobody had told her either. You become what your place needs, if you let yourself. The frontier has a way of drafting people for purposes they didn't apply for. On a July evening, when the light went long and gold over the valley and the creek was low enough that you could hear it from the cabin steps, Gideon sat beside Eliza on those steps with the dogs at their feet and the new barn visible across the yard and the mountains going purple in the distance. And the quiet between them was the kind of quiet that is the opposite of empty. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. She didn't ask often. He didn't ask ever because he could usually tell. But tonight she was curious. He considered it for a moment. "Your father," he said. She looked at him. "The last time I saw him in person, about a year before he died, he told me I was good at surviving and lousy at living." Gideon looked at the mountains. "I argued with him, said surviving and living weren't so different on the frontier." "What did he say?" "He said I was wrong, and that I'd know it when I wasn't doing it alone anymore." A pause. "I told him I wasn't looking for company." "What did he say to that?" Gideon was quiet for a moment. "He said nobody is, and that's what makes it worth something when you find it." Eliza looked at the mountains for a while. "He was right," she said. "He was right," Gideon agreed. Rook put his head on Eliza's knee. Saber leaned against Gideon's leg with the uncomplicated devotion of a dog who has decided that this arrangement of people and place suits him entirely. The evening moved over the ranch, over the new barn and the kitchen garden, and the vegetable rows with their careful stakes and string, over the creek and its corrected boundary, and the land that was theirs and every record that mattered, over the track leading to the road that led to Chalice and to the territory beyond, where people whose names they knew, and some they didn't yet know, were making their own calculations about what was survivable and what was worth protecting. The frontier was still hard. It would always be hard. That was not a problem to be solved, only a condition to be met with enough stubbornness and enough sense to not meet it alone. Thomas Rowan had known this. He'd spent his life knowing it and had arranged, with the last letter he ever wrote, for his daughter to know it too. Not by being told, because she wouldn't have believed it that way, but by being placed in a situation where she could find it out the only way anything real gets learned, which is through the actual doing of it, through the difficult and unglamorous accumulation of days. The mountains went dark. The creek kept moving. Eliza leaned slightly against Gideon's shoulder. Not dramatically, not with announcement, just the small shift of a woman who has decided to stop managing the distance. He didn't move. He didn't comment. He just was there, solid and present and entirely himself. Which was, it turned out, exactly enough. The stars came out over Idaho, indifferent and ancient and impossibly numerous, and below them, on a bench above a creek with a correctly filed water right and a new barn and an uneven table and two people who had found each other by accident and chosen each other on purpose. Life continued, imperfect and stubborn and thoroughly, quietly worth it.